Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I want to talk about Trails of Cold Steel again. I want to talk about this really interesting topic of discussion. It will involve spoilers though, so if you have not seen or played the entirety of the Trails of Cold Steel arc, that includes the 4 games. I'm not including Hajimari or I think the English title is going to be Trails into Reverie, just because I've never played that, so there's nothing for me to spoil in that regard. So I'm not going to use anything from that because I don't know anything from that story, but it is going to specifically relate to the 4 Cold Steel games, and it will involve spoilers, so do know that ahead of time, so you have been warned. But basically this topic is something I came across on the Kaseki subreddit, and I thought it was just an interesting topic where someone had an issue where they wish that the entire arc was about the social class, you know, commoners versus nobles, rather than the whole curse, leaning into the more curse slash the Great Twilight element to it all. And I thought that was such an interesting thing. It was kind of a criticism, but also just, you know, a personal preference on that person's part. And I thought that was such an interesting topic that I thought, like, oh, it would make an interesting video. But I think that's so interesting because I'd say like the first half of the arc, the first 2 games, is basically entirely revolving around the social class system. Because I mean, and I get why that's such an interesting thing, because it's a very unique element to only Erebonia, because Erebonia is the only country in Zemuria that has a class system like that. Every country has its each has their own respective, is what I'm trying to say, issues, and that just ends up being Erebonians. And I understand this person thinking that's such an interesting element to it, which obviously not everyone really likes the political elements of like video games and stuff like that. Just some people just don't like that, so some of that might not have 100% appealed to people anyway. But I really and thoroughly enjoyed it, but I also enjoyed the curse aspects to it too. See, I haven't read too much about, like, you know, why Falcom decided to head in that direction, but truth be told is it feels very like true to Trails, because Trails, like, they always start off with the issues of the respective country, getting to learn it and its history, and then that history comes full circle, usually with the involvement of Ouroboros some shape or form, using that country's respective past in a more like supernatural, mystical sense, and bringing that the present day, and basically the heroes of each respective country having to come together to like deal with said issue. You know, it happened with the what was it, Oriole in Trails, obviously everything with the like Septirian of Mirage in the Crossbell games, so, and obviously, you know, the curse itself with Erebonia. I replied to that post with just, you know, my own personal take and opinion, but I kind of want to dive deeper, you know, kind of a little more long form here. What I thought was interesting is that I believe the social class issue is still there even in 3 and 4. It's just not the main focus that it was, which is still a thing of like, yeah, that person probably still wishes it was the main focus, but I still believe, like, I guess maybe Falcom didn't want to retread the same territory. Like, obviously, like, if they continued it, they would have basically had to continue that for like 2 more games. And to be fair, like, the way they've set it up in 3, the nobility are not as powerful as they once were. Losing the Civil War kind of diminished their power a lot, but that's also where I say that the social class issue still remains, because if it wasn't for the Civil War playing out the way it was, if it wasn't for the class system in the first place, we wouldn't have had that big everything leading up to that, and all of that playing a foundational role in the curse and the Great Twilight getting activated in the first place, because the nobility had lost a lot of their power, and that meant that the provisional army was limited in what they could do. And that was what Osborne did a lot in 3, was like, oh, let's put him and Ouroboros made it so that, like, hey, let's put the provisional army in a very complicated space of like, right, oh, they try to help without the army's backup, they're going to fail miserably, and it's just going to be an example of like, oh, you don't need the nobility around anymore. The reformist faction is so much stronger in 3 going on forward than it was previous, because it was very like back and forth, even scale. But even then, I'd say 1 and 2, the nobility still had like the upper hand and stuff like that. But like I said, it got relegated to the background, but it was still a major theme in the games because it helped influence, and it played into allowing, once again, Osborne and Ouroboros to activate the curse in the first place. Like it was a foundational element. Like everything that, once again, it being a main through line, you couldn't have the groundwork of the curse without the Civil War and everything playing its own role, because they also have to get into the whole aspect of, once again, the country's histories with like the Divine Knights and stuff like that, the War of the Lions being a literal civil war itself. And so it's all reciprocal, it's all connected. It's, you know, kind of history kind of repeating itself again. I mean, that once again, that element kind of resonates throughout kind of all the Trails games in that regard. But like I was bringing up earlier on the subject of, I felt like if they probably did do it for 3 and 4 and made it a mainstay, you'd just be retreading like the same territory, because you dealt with it in such a big, impactful way, like the Civil War. And also you had, even amongst Class 7, that perspective of Machias and Eustace being a major representation of that. I mean, Class 7 as a whole was kind of a representation of it, of like different people from different circumstances, backgrounds, and walks of life. Obviously, you know, you had Reen in a very unique position of being a commoner by blood who was taken in by you know, the Schwarzer family. Yes, his father's only a baron, and barons aren't the highest when it comes to nobility, especially, you know, compared to a count or even one of the 4 great houses like Eustace. So, but he's still a noble regardless, which obviously Maki has had his issues with that, being like, oh, like you lying about is why I had an issue. It had nothing to do with you being a noble. It's like, I still call BS on that, but I digress. The point was mainly leaning into the Machias and Eustace of it all. Like their back and forth is kind of a literal like in-group representation of the back and forth between the nobility and the commoners, and each one coming from their own circumstances, their own backgrounds that led them to what they are. And, you know, nobility or not, everyone has their complicated circumstances, like, you know. And like I said, I think that all kind of got wrapped up nicely in the culmination of it all leading to the Civil War. So it being the main, I mean, maybe the argument could be like, well, maybe you should have just stopped it too, but still there was like so much. I still feel like making the first arc about that like makes a lot of sense, and then like the second half being about the curse and everything, because once again, like it laid the groundwork for the second half of the arc. I don't think the person necessarily, because they didn't get into the nitty gritty of it, they just said the curse. I don't think they necessarily had an issue, once again, with like the magic and all that, because that's like I brought up previously, like that's a mainstay with everything related to Ouroboros, like popping up in each country's respective like situations. Like I wondered, I mean, to be fair, maybe this person never played the other games too, because like I haven't either. I've watched someone play them, but like Trails of Cold Steel has been, like me, for a lot of people, it's their first in the Trails series, so maybe this person doesn't have the perspective of the Sky games or the or Zero and Azure to be like, oh, so Cold Steel is just kind of following the trend. So maybe if they were aware of the other games, maybe they'd be like, oh, like they might have that same issue. I don't know. They were just specifically talking about Cold Steel, so that might be the only one that they've ever played. So they might not have, like I said, those previous games as kind of reference to be like, yeah, that's kind of like typically how these stories kind of evolve in that regard. I mean, it also makes sense to kind of lean more into the curse element too, considering Reen's place in all of it, where his ogre abilities come from, him ultimately being like a sacrifice and his powers being tied to the curse itself. So it makes a lot of sense to kind of lean into that. I mean, and he's a little, once again, representation of that, being like, once again, like him being in a very unique position that he's in, that Class 7's in regard to this whole social class system, but then also at the heart of it all, you know, main protagonist and all, he's at the heart of the Great Twilight as well as a sacrifice. So it all plays into itself, interestingly enough. But like I said, I'm not trying to like put down this person's criticism or preferences. I just thought it was kind of an interesting topic of discussion because of that. Like I said, because I think those through lines like heavily influence each other. And I guess it's like, right, it's easy to say that now, having the entire arc, like what would it have been like if they had just stayed with the social class stuff? But I also feel like that wouldn't have been very Trails of them if they had. you know, because it's all about, once again, diving into each country's history. And yes, social class stuff is a part of Erebonia's history, but there's even darker elements. Obviously, when you start getting into, once again, like the Great One and the Hexen Clan, the Gnomes, the Divine Knights, and all of that. You know, once again, like the history repeating itself, like with the different wars and the different calamities and things that are going down in Erebonia specifically. And kind of going back to talking about it again, as I mentioned multiple times before, the social class system stuff didn't disappear in 3 and 4. It is interesting, speaking of Ring, that I think it doesn't even come up at all. I feel like maybe there's one conversation in 3 about Ring being from his perspective of being a commoner by blood, but being raised in a noble family. Because obviously, like, coming to terms with that was a big part of Ring's journey and trying to find his place in all of this in 1 and 2, and it just cemented his place even more in Class 7. That is like, this is where I belong, this is where I choose to be, surrounded by these people I love and care about. Like, kind of finding, like, his whole journey in general is about finding his place, but even more so in that regard. But in 3 and 4, I don't think it gets brought up at all in 4, but like, I feel like there might have been one instance of it being brought up in 3, but it was never the main point. So once again, it takes a back seat, because obviously, like, there's still like all the 4 great houses having to gather once again, because a lot of the nobility has also power. Obviously, everything with Muse or Lady Mildine as a Cayenne, and her prepping everything, and obviously Aurelia, because that also, like, you know, ties into like everything that's going on with, like, you know, her and Wallace, and obviously Rain being in the middle of everything in Northumbria, like the Northern War and stuff like that. So like, it all plays into that, and once again, it's still foundational. It's just, once again, very much in the background. But obviously, like, you also get the continuation of seeing where Eustace and Machias are, and them being a representation of, once again, not every yes, there are hoity-toity, like, nobles who are terrible people. You have examples like Duke Cayenne, who are selfish and all about power, but you see time and time again that there are nobles who are good people. You see that with Ring, you see that with Laura, that, yeah, he could be a douche nozzle sometimes, but even Eustace is a good guy. When you see, like, his relationship with some of the kids that live in Bereahard, his relationship with Milliam, as well as his relationship with the rest of Class 7. And obviously, like, once again, him and Machias, like, yeah, they still butt heads from time to time because they're both stubborn as hell, but, like, to see their dynamic, how much it's changed and how much they've shifted, how much they've grown in that year that's going by. And even just the journey of 1 and 2, that year journey, and then the year in between 2 and 3, and how much that made them grow as well. So I think, and also, without really getting into it too much, there are other storylines, especially related to Machias, that tie back into, like, that social system thing. So, like, it's still prominent, just not nearly as prominent. And like I said, I'm sure this person just wanted it to be a lot more prominent and in the forefront than what it was, but I get that. But it's not like it completely disappeared. I guess I think they kind of nuanced it even more, that it's like, right, we're not retreading that same road, we are just showing how things have grown. I mean, to be fair, that is something that Erebonia is still going to have to deal with. I mean, even at the end of 4, with the aftermath of everything, maybe Hajimari / Trails into Reverie really touch on that. Kind of like what state Erebonia is in the grand scheme of things, and what that means. Because obviously there's also the conversation of, you know, things need to change in Erebonia, but the point they bring up in 3 is like, yeah, but changing everything all at once can cause more issues, so nobility shouldn't be taken care of completely. Obviously, like, once again, you hear little things about, like, Thor's, for example. Both, like, the main campus and the branch campus didn't have it at all, but the main campus originally had it. But, like, obviously, when the branch campus opened, the main campus's curriculum changed, and it went from, like, the classes being divided by, like, nobility and commoners. That kind of got done away with, at least to my recollection. And they bring it up at least once. It never really gets dived into. But also, like, they never make much of a point of it at branch campus either. But there are people who are part of nobility. Because I think Jessica's a noble, if I remember correctly. I think Kyrie is 2, maybe? I think maybe Luis might be 1, and maybe Tatiana, I think. are just a few examples, but they don't really, once again, lean into that too much because it is such a background thing. Like, there's kind of more important stuff, and I think that's kind of what that kind of represents. So obviously, like I said, just an interesting conversation. I'd love to get to know your opinion in the comments down below. Would you have been someone who would have preferred that the entire arc revolved around the social class system, and even if you take in like the Ouroboros and like the Great Twilight / Curse, like would you have wanted it kind of involve more of that social class stuff being at the forefront, or do you like that Cold Steel went the direction it did? I'm genuinely curious where people's perspectives are on that. Like I said, it's hard to say otherwise because we got what we got, and I love what we got, so I don't know if I'd want it any differently, but you know, in an alternate situation, who knows what going down that other route would have looked like, and maybe I would be saying this, maybe I would be saying the same thing if the situation was different. So like I said, just let me know all your thoughts. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and good